Tēnā koutou katoa. He uri tēnei no inia, ko Qamar Shamim Rawa, ko Anisul Rahman o Kukou Mātua. Ko Kirikiri Roa toku whatumanua, ko Waikato te awa e mahia nei a kuma harahara. Kei Kirikiri Roa a hau e noho ana inaine. Ko Anjum Rahman tuku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Anjum Rahman and I'm part of Tāhono, also known as Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, and really happy that you can join us today for our webinar. I'm going to first of all start us off with our whakatauki, which we also use as an opening karakia, and this was written for us by Professor Tom Roa from the University of Waikato. You'll see, hopefully, that comes through now. Ka hoka a Tāhono I uta, ka hoka a Tāhono I tai, ka rerea a ko whitiwhiti, ka tau ki ko winiwini, ka tau ki ko wanawana, tuturu o whiti whakamaua ki a tina, huie, tai kie. And I'll quickly read the translation. As Tāhono soars across the seas, as Tāhono soars inland, and in leaving those places of significance in the crossing, alights on ko winiwini, on ko wanawana. Let there be an affirming of that. Thank you again. So I'll be the MC for today. And I'll just quickly introduce myself. I've been part of Tāhono since its beginning in 2019, and I'll be talking more about the organisation soon. I'm based in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, where I've lived for most of my life, and so I feel very connected to there, and that is where my sense of belonging is. So about the symposium today, it will be running in 3 parts. So that will be 3 separate sessions. The first session is going to be focusing on media harms and will be facilitated by Nina Temples. The second session will be some wonderful people who are working in the media, or who have a lot of experience of working in the media, speaking about the current mediascape. And that session will be moderated by Koro. The third session will focus on the kinds of solutions that both media and communities may want. So all of our panelists will be able to give input on those, and we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts in terms of your questions. And that session will be moderated by Juliana. There will be a 5-minute break between each session for you all to have grab a cup of coffee or just have a little bit of a break. Each session is going to have time for a Q&A, and we're just letting you know that the chat function for the symposium has been turned off, so please enter your questions using the Q&A function in the chat, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. And if you can't see it, just hit the More button and you'll see the Q&A function there, and you can enter your questions at any time. Our tikanga for today is that we ask you to be respectful when asking your questions. We will be moderating the Q&A, but we really welcome your input through questions. About Tāhono, we were formed in 2019, and our vision is of an Aotearoa New Zealand where everyone has a place to belong. And one of the ways that we build belonging is through supporting community networks that bring together a diverse group of people to work on issues that are common to all of us. We also provide training on various things like te tiriti, belonging online, and a range of other things. We have programs such as our Mātiki Mai reading group, which is all about constitutional transformation, our Bridging Cultures program, and so much more. You can find out about these on our website, tāhono.nz. Tāhono Media is one of our first community networks and has been going since the beginning of 2021. It's a group of wonderful people who have some experience with the media in various ways. And the goal of the group is to improve representation of minority communities within media. And particularly around addressing bias, stereotyping, prejudice, and any other types of harm that might cause media, and also wanting to support media when they're doing a great job. So the purpose of the session today, we want to create a space where people from diverse communities and people working in media can talk about these issues of representation from their perspectives. We really want to build a connection between media and communities so that we can work together, understand each other, and have better media. And we understand, that there are various challenges that we're facing in the current environment. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you again, and pass you on to our first moderator, who is Nina.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Nina. I'm a member of Tāhono Media, formerly known as Media as Allies. We have been working alongside minority cultural communities. We wanted to identify how some media portrayal perpetuates negative stereotypes and bias, which continues to affect equitable access to education, work, and healthcare. We wanted to see what could be done to improve media representation. Some great progress has been made in the media industry. For example, in 2020, staff offered a formal apology to Tangata Whenua. Our group contributed to training materials for journalists and participated at Te Matarau, a staff-sponsored media wānanga. Last year, we hosted a webinar by Broadcasting Standards Authority titled Rebuilding Trust. This year, we have advised the diversity strategy for New Zealand on air. Having said this, we still have a lot of work to do to create a society where everyone feels they belong. In this first session, 3 speakers will discuss what media harm is and who are affected. Our first speaker is Stacey Wood, CEO of Broadcasting Standards Authority. Our second speaker is Professor Mohan Dutta from Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, Massey University. His talk was recorded because he is currently overseas. Our third speaker is Dr. Belinda Borell, Ngati Ranginui Ngāi Te Rangi Whakatohia from Whariki Research Centre, Massey University, and Kuputaia, a Maori and Pākehā Media Research Group. There will be time for Q&A following all 3 panelists have spoken. I'm going to hand over to Stacey. I'm looking forward to hearing what you are here to tell us.
Kia ora. Thanks for that introduction. I'm called Stacey Aho. I'm speaking to you today as the CE of the Broadcasting Standards Authority. And you may have heard about us a little bit more than usual this week. We've had a bit of attention. We are a media regulator. So we do believe in responsible regulation of professional media, but believe it or not, we also think freedom of expression is important, indeed fundamental. So the BSA is an independent Crown entity. We have 3 functions. We determine complaints about media. We do education and engagement, and we have oversight of broadcasting standards and their development. We were established by a 1989 Act, which is also getting a bit of attention this week due to the fact that it was written in a pre-internet, or just as the internet was coming into existence era. Media looked a lot different back then. There were fewer voices. There were only a very small handful, if you can call it that, of broadcasters, single sources of information, whereas now we're living in a time where media is very fragmented, very pluralistic. There are a lot of voices with very different perspectives on similar issues, and that comes with some great benefits and some challenges. So benefits including diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, the ability for different voices to be heard, but challenges in terms of working out how that should be regulated, if it should be regulated, challenges in determining what's the truth if you're hearing multiple versions of a story, and who gets to decide that. So our current issue, which you may have read about if you're engaged with news media, is that we've accepted a complaint for the first time about an online broadcaster. So it's first time we've had a complaint like this, and it's brought up a lot of discussion about what modern media regulation needs to look like compared with what we have now. And some people have been surprised to learn a few things about what our current Act says. So some people have been surprised to learn the definition of broadcast that's written into our Act doesn't limit itself to television and radio. Other people have been surprised that we can only act when we receive a complaint. We don't have proactive powers as a regulator. Other people have been surprised that we have to accept every complaint that meets the formal requirements. We don't pick and choose our complaints that we take. And it's also been brought to a lot of people's attention that the wording of the Act is really difficult to apply to a lot of online media. Some online broadcasters clearly, to us, meet the requirements of the Act, but people are right when they say that there are grey areas. And we've been saying for about 15 years that the law needs to be updated. So that's the big issue that we're facing in our role in the mediascape at the moment. And our role is to regulate broadcast media and uphold freedom of expression while preventing undue harm. And freedom of expression is our fundamental sort of reason for being. There's a really high threshold for the authority to decide that there's been a breach of standards. We're not the good taste police. Freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. And I think it's important to note the difference between freedom of expression per the Bill of Rights and sort of an absolutist free speech principle. So freedom of expression in a New Zealand context, as with some comparable jurisdictions in Europe, but different to the US, includes the right for people to impart and receive information. And it's information that we may disagree with or find distasteful or which doesn't align with our values, but that right to choose what you put out there and what you seek and receive. So often the authority will decline to uphold a complaint about a program which, while it doesn't breach a standard, it's certainly not adding to the quality of public discourse. But there's a recognition that the cure for bad speech is often more speech. So better for a lot of ideas to be allowed to be expressed so that they can be rebutted rather than driven underground. The authority walks this sort of fine balance between protecting against harm and giving people that right to say and to hear what they want, knowing that limiting freedom of expression is a really serious thing. And so that's where our education and engagement function is really important. We don't just do complaints. And, educating people, giving prominence to media that reports responsibly, telling people, educating on media literacy, critical thinking, that kind of thing, can limit sort of the effect of media that might be misinforming or misrepresenting facts. And, we talk a lot about balancing freedom of expression against undue harm, and sometimes people wrinkle their noses a bit when we talk about harm and think that we're talking about anything that offends people. And it's not the same thing. So some examples of real harm that have been brought up in relation to some previous media regulation decisions, like a broadcast that called for the execution of all gay people, or another one which televised a young child getting paternity test results read out to them on the television. Another good example is breaches of privacy, which can cause real-world harm to people, and lead to them being intimidated or threatened or having intimate details shared about them without their consent. So these are all things that are recognised in our Act as things that could cause actual harm to people and that there should be limits on. The authority's job is to reflect community standards, not to set its own standards. So while the Act does have some requirements about what the standards are required to cover, we do regular research engagement with all sorts of communities to make sure that we've got a good foundation of evidence for what those standards are. And they do change over time. And consistently, we get external reviews done. We do litmus testing with focus groups. We do broadcaster surveys. And consistently, we find that most of the general public agree with where those standards are set, how they've been applied, that our decisions are consistent, and that we can be relied on to treat complaints fairly across over time. We also do a survey every 3 years about what kind of language people find offensive in broadcasting, which people always enjoy reading because it has swears in it. But that's interesting as well because those change too. It used to be that blasphemy and more traditional swears like your F words ranked quite highly on the list, but over time we've seen a softening towards those words, but less of a tolerance of language like slurs that are based on people's identity or their race, their disability, their sexuality. And it's interesting to see the offensiveness move more from words that are offensive just because of the word that they are versus the intent of the word to denigrate somebody. So derogatory terms rank quite highly on the list of offensive ones now. And preview, that survey will be coming out again towards the end of this year. So a lot of the discussion about our jurisdiction at the moment is around what the best way to regulate media for the future could be. We have a complaint. We have a complaint, which is about an online broadcaster, but what we've also been saying is that we need a new act. Because a system where we have to respond to every complaint that comes to us if it meets the formal requirements isn't, some would say, an efficient way to moderate content standards in an online world. And in that online world where it's getting harder and harder to tell what's real, what's AI, what's true, what's not true, it's still important there's some kind of independent media regulator available for people to know, at least when it comes to professional media, where to go for reliable, truthful information. And another reason why a complaints-based system is less than ideal is not everyone's comfortable complaining to a regulator, and that could be for individual, for cultural, professional reasons. People fairly worry that about having something with their name on it on the internet forever. And it shouldn't be reliant on a regulator shouldn't be reliant on a complaint coming to it to be able to uphold its standards, is our view. Other people are very comfortable complaining to us, but they may have a very different threshold for what they think is a breach of standards. And as a result, we get quite a number of complaints that we need to respond to that don't reach a level of harm to justify intervention. We've upheld less than 10% of complaints in the last few years. We still think there's a role for media regulation. I think we've seen with social media, which is different to professional media, but we've seen with some social media platforms the results of a total lack of moderation and lack of regulation. As a result of doing my job this week, I've had people digging out old photos of me, commenting on my appearance. Yes, I have thick ankles, that's fine. My gender, my perceived politics, making some pretty gross comments. And the goal is obviously not to engage on an intellectual level, but to ridicule and humiliate me. And so I can see why a lot of people would be discouraged from participating in public forums where this is likely to be the result. And when that happens, freedom of expression is actually being limited, not protected. So turning really quickly to possible solutions, the government has consulted several times over the last few years on possible regulatory changes. The current proposal, which was consulted on earlier this year, is to modernise the broadcasting standards regime to cover all professional media operating in New Zealand, not just broadcasters. And the role of the regulator would be revised with more of a focus on system-level outcomes, which is such a bureaucratic catch-all of a term. But what that might mean in reality is a move away from individual complaints-based systems that take months to work through to checking that professional media have a set of standards that they're applying, that they're acting responsibly, that people know where they can go to get reliable media that abides by professional standards. So again, only talking about professional media in this consulted option, not social media. There's entire dissertations around what responsible social media regulation might look like. But long story short, our focus on freedom of expression supports everyone having a voice and everyone having a chance to have their stories told and to hear the stories that they want to hear. And in the absence of any kind of regulation, someone still decides what voices and stories get elevated and which ones get muted or silenced. And if people aren't speaking publicly, which we're seeing a lot, that has implications for freedom of expression. If it's not an independent regulator deciding what the standards are, somebody else will decide and they'll have their own agenda. I think any future regulation needs to take into account AI. It's a challenge, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. But our guiding principle is that people should have access to accurate and reliable information about the world around them. And they should have somewhere they can turn when minimum standards are not being met. And at the moment, we're the regulator. We've got a current act we need to apply. We'll keep doing that till we get a new one.
Cool. Thank you, Stacey. Is that everything you would like to share with us right now?
Pardon?
Oh, is that everything you would like to share right
that
now?
Is, yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Now we'll share Mohan's video.
Kia ora koutou. I want to begin by thanking Tāhono Media for this invitation, and I so wish I could join you in this dialogue. What I thought I will share today are some theoretical observations, broad conceptual points about media and whiteness in this particular presentation, looking at broader concepts around how media are organized. Based on this, then, I will do a follow-up presentation, a brief one, on what are the kinds of potential solutions that we could be looking at. So in this particular presentation, I would look at the organizing of hegemonic media structures and particularly attend to the concept of whiteness, the hegemonic values of white culture that are upheld as universal, arguing that whiteness shapes both the structures as well as the everyday practices of mainstream media in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then put forth the concept of voice infrastructures, which I will then expand upon in the next brief conversation. Now, whiteness, as I said, it refers to the hegemonic values of white culture that are upheld and circulated as universal. So if we think about the history of contemporary media architectures, we might argue that the overarching values that shape these media structures reflect the values of white culture and therefore are embedded within the intertwined relationship among settler colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. So it continually puts forth and reproduces notions of media practice that uphold these projects of settler colonialism and empire. So when we come to this question of whiteness in media, and particularly looking at the hegemonic values of white culture, what do I mean by this? Let's, for instance, look at the concept of news values. The very idea of news values, how these news values are taught, which shape then the construction of journalistic practices, news reporting practices in the media, reflect the underlying ideology of whiteness that operates on notions of individualism, private property, reductionism, in order to construct that which is news. If you particularly look at the concepts of objectivity and balance, which are often put forth as the organizing principles that shape, for instance, how news reporting is done in mainstream media, all the way from agenda setting to the framing of news stories. One might argue that these values represent the overarching agendas of white culture, so that when we talk about, for instance, notions of balance, that often erases the deep inequalities that shape the settler colonial project, the processes of land occupation, the processes of expulsion and extraction that shape the organizing of systems, but that also then shape how these organizing processes are talked about and represented in the media. So what that then results in is the ongoing violence of the erasure of the voices from the margins. So one might argue that, well, if we look at contemporary questions of media representation, for instance, through decades of organizing of diverse communities, have we not seen shifts in the frames through which media represent stories? While that kind of multicultural representation might create some openings for incrementalism in media narratives, some incremental forms of representation, whether it is in stories or whether it is in the character and form of the newsroom, whether it is in the diversity of the media architecture to some extent. What I'm arguing here is that the overarching structure, its logics and its values remain intact. So in that sense, the project of the media architecture in a settler colonial context, such as Aotearoa, continues to reproduce the disenfranchisement of those at the margins, and particularly the disenfranchisement of Tangata Whenua, of Maori in Aotearoa. But also when we look at the broader imperial project, continues to reproduce the disenfranchisement of communities at the global margins that experience the violence of settler colonialism and imperialism. If you consider, for instance, the mainstream media coverage of Israel and the ongoing genocide in Gaza, what you see is the concept of balance framed as a tool for how media stories represent the genocide actually shapes then the turning of the genocide into a narrative of conflict or into a narrative of both sides, which fundamentally undermines the power of the colonial project, but also simultaneously participates in the erasure of Palestinian voices. So when you then have a Radio New Zealand report, for instance, a report that critically examines its own coverage of Gaza, what you see there is an embedded value of whiteness that fails to take into account the complicity of the media architecture within the broader settler colonial imperial project. So, particularly within the context of settler colonial politics and imperial geostrategy, it is critical to think about the sort of power and control that is maintained in the hands of the owners of capital and how that plays out in terms of the ownership patterns of the media. So it's worthwhile to ask who own the media and how do these ownership patterns then shape the kinds of stories that are constructed and the kinds of frames around which we come to both produce news, but also receive and consume news. It is then critical for us to really think through the ways in which these broader media architectures are aligned with extractive agendas of global capital. If you look at global media ownership patterns, for instance, you see critical alignments between the extractive industries, between the extractive neoliberal industries at the frontiers of capital and the media industries. And in that sense, it is then critical for us to consider what are the ramifications for the kinds of stories that are produced and the kinds of agendas that are served by these stories. As I move toward wrapping up, then I invite us to think about, and sorry for the care logo covering up the last few words on that first line. It should read media's propaganda infrastructures of fascism. So I invite us to think about the role that the othering processes in mainstream media play toward the kind of authoritarian impulses that work through the othering of disenfranchised communities, media constructions that continually perform communicative inversions, that invert materiality on its head in order to serve particular the forms of cultural nationalist narratives that work through othering, and then media as infrastructures that legitimize genocide, as we see in the example of Gaza, that offers the narrative and the tool of balance in order to prop up the architecture of genocide. Now, if you specifically look at representation, and I know that we have a number of presenters in the whole day's event who are going to talk about these kinds of issues, but when we then think about the question of racism in the media, what I am inviting us to think about is the ways in which racism is fundamentally built into the very structure of the media. So media as resources that uphold narratives of hate, that continually work through channeling of stories that construct the other as less than, as primitive, as savages, as incapable of civility. So I've written quite a bit about the ways in which the language of civility works through the architecture of media. So if you look at mainstream media coverage on the performance on Haka, you see how that narrative of civility is continually reproduced without fundamentally questioning the violence of the colonial project and the power of the colonial project in setting up the terms of civility. In this backdrop, as these media architectures continue to reproduce these racialized structures, what we also see is far-right organizing around concepts such as trust or trust in the media. So the continual attack on institutions of media deployed from the far-right, often drawing on metrics such as the trust barometer, the Edelman trust barometer, to say that there is a left-wing, woke, critical race theory bias in the media, actually further pushes these hegemonic organizing structures. So we also have to be critical simultaneously of the ways in which particular narratives, such as narratives of trust, are deployed in order to critique any opening for the voices of the marginalized within mainstream media. So it's an interesting balance in that sense, because any study or any work or organizing that talks about decolonizing the media simultaneously has to negotiate the far-right architectures that are continually targeting and attacking the media and any openings that are created within media architectures. So how you balance this is a critical question, and in the next segment, I will talk about this notion of building voice infrastructures in communities, creating narrative and storytelling capacities in communities, building community media as the basis for both challenging the far right and at the same time holding the hegemonic media architectures to account, not only in terms of offering critique and interrogating questions of representation, but also in terms of fundamentally raising questions of ownership and questions of distribution patterns. So in conclusion, as I sort of think about the role of media as architectures of whiteness, I invite you to consider the ways in which media narratives uphold structures of surveillance, justify ongoing acts of violence, while simultaneously participating in the marking of the other as terror, which legitimizes colonial terror and leaves intact the violence of the settler colonial imperial state structures. So interrogate critically the structures of control, power and control that shape media resources, interrogate the limits of multiculturalism crafted within hegemonic narratives of whiteness, particularly in terms of notions of representation. I think representation is not enough. We fundamentally have to ask questions of ownership and resource redistribution and explore organizing processes that are necessary for structural transformations in mainstream media. Nami Hindui.
Thanks, Mohan. I'm going to hand over to Belinda now.
Okay, kia ora. I have to share a request to share. Send a request. Okay. Yeah, kia ora, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Belinda Borell, He uri au no Te Ranga Moana. My family are a very large family from a little place called Te Puna, which is just before you get to Tauranga. Born and bred in Manurewa, South Auckland, which is where I'm coming from today. Really enjoyed both the first two speakers, and my talk is going to be a little bit about an example of what Mohan has been kind of talking about. So I'm part of Kupitaia, which is a research group that's looked at, okay, how do I make that big? Okay, it's looked at media representations of Māori Pākehā relations to TDT, and so on. And I'm not going to be talking specifically about that, but we have conducted kind of large-scale monitoring projects of media representations on that. And what that's kind of led us to begin thinking about is how kind of underlying representations, how kind of underlying societal racism and to a lesser degree kind of sexism and ageism and the difference between rurality and urban people is playing out in kind of representations of poverty and the media's role. So that's kind of basically what I'm talking about today. Okay, so we're going to be talking a bit about the representations of poverty via imagery, via videos, and then via kind of some of the language tropes and discourses. I'm going to go through it very quickly. I want to stick on time. Can I get rid of that out of the way? Yeah, and that many of these representations make consistent reference to race. And I mean, for an audience like this, we don't need to kind of hopefully go into the idea of race, but basically race in a modern interpretation is kind of a reference to the social interpretation of how we look is our kind of definition. And so it is relevant, I think, because a lot of the representations are visual, and that a lot of these representations of poverty in our media have very little relationship to statistical accuracy. I want to talk briefly about the difference between the ethnicity rate of something and the actual cases, and where I've looked at this issue, particularly around child poverty, domestic violence, and smoking rates. Today, I'm just going to be sort of talking about poverty. And so I've done a quick Google search. So I do this every now and then, actually. Last week, where I did a whole round of Google image searches and looked at Māori poverty in New Zealand. This is sort of a thing of what comes up. And you'll see there's quite a number of images of people. And I think that's quite revealing, but I actually thought it was actually more revealing if you did a Google search of Pākehā poverty in New Zealand. This is what comes up. And so invariably, all of the actual pictures of humans start to disappear, and the ones that you do see actually are of Māori people. So I found that actually quite fascinating. And in fact, the only one of Pākehā people you'll see is this picture here, is actually from the New Zealand Encyclopedia about a large Pākehā family. And that's really the only image that you see of Pākehā human beings when you're actually doing reference to Pākehā poverty. So Pākehā poverty in New Zealand, actually, apart from a couple of pictures of the Prime Minister at the time, are actually images of Māori, which I felt was actually kind of proves a bit of the point that I'm trying to make. And so just to zoom in on a few of these are sort of some of the images that have been used. And of course, you'll start to see a pattern here. This is the Salvation Army. So it's not just kind of news. Even people in the help industries, right, do have these, exorbitantly disproportionate use of people of colour in terms of their representation of the issues, BBC. So this is CPAG. So CPAG has since sort of changed some of the imagery based on some of the conversations that we've had. So, yeah, there is, you see there is this kind of pattern that kind of shows itself. So what are the actual numbers? The first sort of group of numbers here, which is the child poverty rate. So this is the rate, the ethnicity rate, as it were. So these are the numbers of poor children as a proportion of all children in that ethnic group. And this is this first line here, this first box. And these are the numbers, these are the proportions that are often reported, right? These are and so these are the representation. This is what people really believe the child poverty figures are. And as a proportion of those ethnic groups, that's true. But when you're reporting on the actual issue of poverty, it's discerning then to actually talk about the ethnic proportions of all poor children. And then, of course, that number is actually quite different. And I think the Pākehā one shows this really, really clearly. So, of course, the Pākehā rate, the ethnicity rate, so 10% of all Pākehā children are in poverty. That's what that number means. Of all poor children, 48% of them are Pākehā. Now, when we think about the kind of numbers of media imagery around this issue, well, we've just looked at Pākehā poverty in New Zealand as a Google search, and we couldn't find any images, right, of Pākehā people. We found one out of that kind of group of about 50. And so when we think about the media's own values of fairness, accuracy and balance, well, it seems to me that a lot of the imagery that we are seeing is none of those things when we actually have a discerning look at it. Even if we were actually to report that, non-Pākehā people, even if we're looking at the rate, so 28% and 22% together is 50. If even half of the imagery was of non-white people, then you could kind of sort of think, okay, well, there's something in that. But what we see is it's not 50%, and in fact, we think it's far, far more than that. In America, they've been able to kind of prove that there's an exorbitant. So Black people, for instance, make up about the same as Māori, about a third of all poor people in America are Black, but they make up about 70% of all the imagery that's used to show the poor are Black people. And they've been able to prove that it's that primary saturation of Black people as poor that's the key driver behind attitudes towards not helping the poor, basically. And I'll talk briefly sort of about that. So what does this kind of, in terms of harms, what does this kind of produce? Well, it kind of produces things like this. And I find this cartoon quite interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that if you think that, the ethnicity rates are a real accurate reflection of what poverty as a whole looks like, then and people do, then these start to kind of make a little bit more sense. The other interesting, despite most poor people, of course, being Pākehā, I think the other thing that's interesting is the discourse in the bubble. So I think if we had, and I mean, you can do this as a thought experiment maybe ourselves, if we remove the picture and just looked at the use of those words, I think there's an incredible racial connotation to the use of those words. If we closed our eyes and that was said to us, what are the images that come to mind? My sense is that would actually be quite a racialized perception. And so some of the so while there is the strong evidence base for this in America, we have no evidential base to support the idea that exorbitant representations of non-white people in the media is a key driver behind a lack of public support for anti-poverty measures. We don't have that evidential base in New Zealand, so I am trying to create it. And so we have a very small project that was lucky to be funded and was funded prior to this government being elected, or would have to probably go to Australia to get it funded. But so our basic hypothesis is that the disproportionate representations of non-white people, particularly Māori, but also women, younger people, and to some degree urban people, as opposed to rurality, as the primary recipients of poverty reduction measures, are over time driving lower public empathy towards those in need, entrenching punitive attitudes and precluding necessary interventions. Basically, our key ideas, these are our kind of key ideas, similar to some of the things that Mohan has been talking about. Very interested in kind of a lot of the American literature, because of course this is sort of where the key theoretical kind of and the key kind of evidential base of this is from. And a really interesting book, if anyone ever wants to look this up, is Martin Gillen's book called Why Americans Hate Welfare. And basically he's doing, I've copied his basic method, where he has looked at representations in the media and matched those towards public attitudes and kind of public surveys around this issue and others. We're looking at it across 3 different time periods. So from the beginning of the Social Security Act in 1938. So, and it's been very interesting. I've been looking at this data. And the 1930s, firstly, just the absolute proliferation of local newspapers. Like, there were hundreds of local newspapers. And to think now how few of these, like Poverty Bay had a herald, had a newspaper. Some of these absolutely tiniest towns had their own newspapers. It's been a very interesting kind of examination. So when Social Security was really kind of firstly devised in this country, the perception of who would benefit from that were largely white men, middle-aged white men in the great, suffering through the Great Depression. And the public support for these programs was incredibly high at that time. As more women and more Māori and more brown people and migrants and others have got access to those programs, it's our belief that the public support for anti-poverty measures has decreased. And we don't think that that's correlational. We think that's probably causational. We're very interested in the neoliberal reforms around the 1980s and 90s, and then looking at that in present day. We're kind of doing a bit of content analysis, similar to what we've done with Kuputaia work, all of which you can find on the Treaty Resource Centre website. So we're doing some kind of content, discourse and sentiment analyses around media catchments in each of these 3 times. We want to measure that with whether the demographic representation reflect the statistical accuracy, and then to match those as best we can to shifts in public attitudes. I think one of the really interesting things that we might have forgotten now, but was actually a key kind of thing in the pandemic was, I don't know if you remember, that there was changes to how we were going to do benefits, for instance, how benefits were going to be allocated. And there were these differences that were being, in terms of not just the money that was being allocated, but in terms of some of the restrictions and some of the bureaucracy that they would need to go through to access welfare was going to be very different if you were made poor by the pandemic as to compared to whether you were poor before the pandemic. And so I think that in itself raised some very fascinating ideas about who was, in terms of how we understand the deserving poor and what that looks like, and what that kind of means in terms of how we look at that issue. And so just sort of some of the take homes, I think, just in conclusion, I'm not sure where my time is at, but I'm trying to go better. I think it's really important to mention, particularly in an audience like this, that we don't need to sort of think about that not all news reporters are out there trying to be these kind of racist people. What I think is that there's a general, at best, probably indifference, to actually how these stories are being presented. And that we need to be a little bit more discerning about that, I think, just in the way that these stories are being put together, and the language that's being used, the imagery and the role of emotion, and to really give effect to the idea of fairness, balance and accuracy, because a lot of, it's very difficult to make that argument, I think, that these are fair, that these representations are balanced, and that they are actually accurate. Because when you look at these broader numbers, they don't seem to be any of that. Stats New Zealand has taken to reporting every now and then. They don't do it often. So you'll see in my my table, can I go back to it? Is that okay? In my table here, these first block of numbers, 22, 28, 10, absolutely anywhere you could find those. They were easy to find. The proportion of all poor children was actually much more difficult. And so I had to do that, calculating that myself using the raw numbers that Stats New Zealand gave in this one sheet. And that was back in 2019. They haven't really done that since. And so I had to go through and calculate based on the raw numbers that they gave in that item, what the actual proportion of all poor children were in terms of their ethnic group makeup. So these are not regularly done, and I'm a big thing for the place of raw numbers in terms of that. I think that and this is not just in journalism, this is in our own sector as well, that we're not always very clear about what the denominator is. What is the group that we're actually talking about, and how are we using them? Are we talking about ethnic groups, or are we talking about poor people? And I think those are different denominators, and we need to be a little bit more clear about what it is that we are using. I think as a whole that maybe it's human nature to buffer ourselves from the depth of what societal racism actually looks like. So I've done this before. I've done this many times in talks where I've asked the audience, did you know that most poor children in this country are Pākehā? Firstly, they don't believe you. They don't think that's true. You show them a table with the actual numbers, and almost immediately it changes how they feel about that issue. They'll say things like, oh my God, I had no idea. We really do need to do something about this. All of the explanations prior about bad parenting and needing, the kind of whole bootstraps narrative all start to kind of fall away. And we start to think of, they start to bring up kind of systemic issues. There's a sense of outrage that they didn't exist before. And this is not just Pākehā participants, this is non-white participants as well, because I think, as Mohan was talking about, whiteness is kind of a structure. And though while we might say in our conscious minds that all children deserve whatever and all children matter, actually in our subconscious mind, in our underlying societal view, not all children are treated the same. We don't have the same view about the importance of all children. And I think for us as professionals, we need to be a little bit more honest about that with ourselves, and consider, how to foresee how our stories will be interpreted and what responsibility we have to accept in terms of perpetuating inequities through perpetuating particular types of attitudes. And that becomes more likely, I think, when we don't keep a discerning eye on how these representations happen and what that means. And that goes for the reporters on the ground, their editors, all the way kind of up the chain. I think there needs to be far more monitoring of that sort, which I don't think is actually difficult to do. The last kind of thing I want to talk about is the issue of intent. So I don't want to get across the idea that, everyone's walking around, these kind of racist, that there's these racist people, because I don't think that actually helps. However, this issue particularly around Māori representation, has been something that has been a regular and consistent finding since at least the 1950s, that fairness, balance and accuracy are sorely wanting in terms of representation of that particular group. I find it's a difficult claim to think then that continues decade after decade after decade, and we can say there's no intent, that doesn't prescribe intent. And so that's sort of where I kind of want to leave it. Open to questions. I've got a lot of references around this particular stuff. If people are interested, they can get in touch with the organisers and we can kind of manage that. Okay, kia ora.
Thanks, Belinda. I'm gonna ask one question for you and then one question for Stacey. So first, Belinda, do you have any concerns about how the ditching of the national census might impact the collection of data or putting together that evidential base you're talking about?
I'm not a statistician, and I understand from statisticians that there is less concern than in particular aspects of the general public, because of a lot of that statistical information is being gathered elsewhere. I think the census is, but I think the census does serve other purposes than just the pure collection of information. But yeah, I mean, personally, I like the idea of having a census, if nothing else, for measuring things consistently. But from what I understand from demographers and statisticians, is that a lot of that information is collected elsewhere. So yeah, I'm probably better if a statistician pipes in rather than me about that.
Thank you. Stacey, you talked about how public tolerance has shifted from swear words to slurs that attack people's identities. What does that tell us about how societal attitudes towards diversity and inclusion are changing in Aotearoa?
Really good question. And I have to admit my expertise is not in sociology or the academic side of that. Our research is, I guess, somewhat surface level, in that we ask people about what words they find offensive, and we do some analysis of the results, but would take someone of Belinda's caliber probably to look at the academic aspects of that. I think what we can see, though, well, what I like to read it as a move towards more tolerance and inclusion, and a desire for media to, or for anyone using that language, I guess, to not use language that denigrates people based on their identity. Words that are, used for effect, swear words that used to be considered offensive, like the F word, shit, bugger, etc. There's sort of a sense of manners around them, I suppose, that people aren't so worried about that anymore. But if you are saying something with an intent to run someone down, humiliate them, belittle them, attack them for who they are, there's less tolerance of that. And I think that's a good trend. I hope it continues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Belinda and Stacey. I'm just going to quickly summarize the session. We heard from Stacey about the shortcomings of the media regulatory landscape in responding to harms. Legislation is clearly outdated, and we probably need to think about there's more harm is increasingly occurring in the unregulated online spaces, and it raises issues about equity and fairness, how we might be allowing ongoing online platforms to avoid the same level of scrutiny that traditional broadcasters face, and potentially giving them an uneven playing field. You talked about fine balance between balancing, the freedom of expressions and undue harm, and how we can create a safe and inclusive community in the evolving landscape. Mohan explored how the dominant culture of whiteness shapes media narrative, reflecting its colonial legacy and racialized power dynamics. And as we could see from the genocide in Gaza, the media often help create the environment where ongoing acts of violence is justified through othering marginalized communities. He discussed how digital platform infrastructures carry white supremacist disinformation, and how meaningful justice-oriented dialogue must center marginalized communities and listen to these voices. Belinda discussed the racialized representation of poverty, and the dominant media narratives of poverty often replicates colonial logics, such as Maori at risk or burden, without drawing an attention to historic colonial disposition and intergenerational inequity. The child poverty example was very great example of highlighting that actually the 48% of all children in poverty is Pakeha, whereas in the media we see more and more Maori images. And it raises the questions about the historic privilege and status threats there white is facing. And we need to have more reporting with justice and promote structural awareness around these issues. Thank you, everyone. We will have a 5 minutes break before returning to session 2.
Kia koutou, welcome back. Hope you managed to get a refreshing drink. We'll now be moving to Koro, who is moderating the second session with perspectives from people working in the media. Thank you.
Kia ora, Anjum. Ia, tēnā tātou katoa, nau mai hoki mai ki te hui taumata nei. Welcome back to the Bridging the Gap webinar. As you heard, we're now heading into session 2. Ko ai au, I te taho o tōku papa, ko kolomotua te kāinga, ko tonga te iwi, I te taho o tōku mama, ko whangataua te maunga, ko kariri kura te moana, ko tinana te waka, ko te rarawa te iwi, ko Ngāti Waioro te hapū, ko Koro Wakauta tōku ingoa. So I'm Koro, son of a Tongan migrant to Aotearoa in the 60s, and a wahine te rarawa, who also has connections to East London. I'm based in Te Whanganui a Tara. Over the last 20 years or so, I worked in the journalism field at organisations like RNZ before moving into the human rights sector at Te Kāhui Tika Tangata. And now I'm working in the local government space, working in community communications. I've been a member of Tāhono Media, which is, as mentioned previously, a rōpū which seeks to build connections between the media and marginalised communities and build positive connections generally. This next session will have kōrero, we'll hear kōrero and whakaaro around the changing media landscape and environment, things like the challenges that the media face that have to deal with, including things like the rise of mis and disinformation, media conglomeration and what that means for diverse voices and representation, technological advances and platforms, and all those sorts of things. But we have an amazing panel. We have Paula Penfold, who's an investigative journalist who across 3 decades has worked for various media, but currently does a lot of work for Stuff and 3 News, and her work has touched on areas like human rights and social justice. So we're really privileged to have Paula with us as well. Olivia Shivas is the editor of The D-List, a hub for disability culture in Aotearoa. Also had podcasts in the past, and just as a great content creator in Aotearoa, has whakapapa to Malaysia and Scotland, and is a 3rd-generation disabled person who's a passionate storyteller. So we're also honoured to have her on this panel. Carmen Parahi is also here, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Hine, Rongo Whakata. Carmen's also a multi-award winning journalist, media executive and communication specialist. You probably would have heard in the past she's been pivotal in the creation of Stuff's Potiaki strategy, which was groundbreaking, and we're honoured to have her in this space as well. And of course we've got Moana Maniapoto, Te Aroa Ngāti Tūwhare Tō, who's also a journalist, a musician, documentary maker, and fronts Te Ao with Moana, which is up for Best Current Affairs at the upcoming, and Moana's up for Best Current Affairs presenter at the upcoming New Zealand Screen Awards. So we have some amazing, wise, experienced and talented people to hear from. So I will cease my waha now, because you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from the people we have in the room. So first of all, I'll pass the rako on to Paula.
Tēnā koutou te iwi. I apologise, there seems to be something that has gone wrong just in the last few minutes with my camera. So I'm not sure that you can see me, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Anyway, hopefully you can hear me. I apologise too if you can hear some snoring in the background. That's my dog asleep on the floor next to me. Tēnā koutou te iwi. Thank you so much for organising this hui today. It's a really important kōrero to have. I acknowledge the speakers who have gone before. It's quite confronting, I must say, as a working journalist, to hear some of what they have said. And I acknowledge what they have said. I acknowledge that media has a lot of work to do. As Kōrero has mentioned, I've been a journalist for quite a long time. I'm currently an investigative journalist at Stuff. And I speak here today, obviously, as an individual working journalist. I'm not representative of the company. I'm not a manager. I am a practicing journalist. And I'd like to give you some kind of, I guess, context to put around some of the challenges that we've heard outlined today. One of the things that has been referenced is mainstream media's duty to report accurately, fairly, and with balance. We have our own ethical standards within our companies. We have codes of practice. We have rigorous editorial checks. As you've just heard, these are not perfect and the outcomes can be far from perfect, but I think they're important. I absolutely think that they are safeguards. You might be surprised to know the rigor that is exercised within newsrooms to make sure that we report accurately, fairly, and with balance. But I acknowledge also what has been said around this, the particular lenses that might come through, which might be reflected because of the makeup of the newsrooms, and because of the traditional structures that Belinda has just been talking about. Carmen did some incredible work a few years ago at Stuff to try to address some of those concerns and to, in the very first instance, acknowledge them publicly in an effort that we might do better, and we are still trying to be better. I want to talk a little bit about the democratic function of journalism, because I think it's really, really important right now to be talking about that, because it has been a really brutal couple of years, not just couple, 5, 10, 20 years in media companies. I mean, this is not a woe is me or my industry story, but I think it is important to acknowledge the context within which some of these challenges that we're talking about today exist. Because I've got to be honest and say that we don't often get the chance to talk about or think about or look at this bigger picture. I mean, I wish we could, but the reality is that we don't often, and that's a failing, but it's also a reality. Because you will have noticed that in the past couple of years, there are fewer of us working journalists. There are whole entire programs that have gone, whole newsrooms that don't exist anymore. So for those of us who remain, we try quite hard to do our best and to consider these issues, but we're also doing that against a backdrop of fewer resources, working for media companies that are facing economic pressures, up against social media multinationals that are soaking up so much revenue while paying very little tax. Increasingly, even just in this past week, you look at worldwide attempts to control or sideline media by very powerful people. You look at what's happening in the White House, where you've got the Secretary of Defense instructing that journalists can't report anything unless it's been authorized for release. I mean, we know what the word is for that, don't we? And those pressures are happening here too in different ways. You look back at history and you can describe that, you can give that a word. And we know that people who don't want to be held to account are threatened by an industry whose very job, whose very existence is to hold people to account and institutions to account. To me, the very essence of the democratic function of journalism is actually very simple. Is to give people information, to inform people so that they can make decisions about how they want to live in their community and their society and their country. But we are, as working journalists, I think, finding increasingly challenges put in front of us to uphold that core function. And one of the things that I want to acknowledge, on top of the harms that have been described, and one that has been alluded to, is not only the stories that are told in ways that perpetuate harms and that could be done better and should be done better. The one thing that keeps me awake at night, not the one thing, one of the things, the biggest thing that keeps me awake at night, and that I find quite overwhelming and confronting right now, is the list of stories I have in my actual list called Stories List. And right now, this week, it's got 30 stories on it. I just counted them before so that I could give you an idea of what it's like to work in a newsroom at the moment. I won't do those 30 stories because once I've knocked off the top 2 or 3 that I need to do this week, they'll be replaced by some more urgent ones. So the ones that are the bottom 15 or 20 won't get done by me, and that probably means they won't be done because there's not that many journalists left to tell them. And I consider myself one of the fortunate journalists because I am still given time. I don't get the time that I used to when I was working in the Stuff Circuit team, which was one of the journalistic teams that was, faced the consequences of these straitened economic times that media companies are facing. I don't get that time anymore, but I still get time to delve into a story in some depth. But there are fewer of us to delve into those stories now. And I think there's a real ramification of the stories that don't get told. I think, and I'll close shortly, but I also think that one of the things that we need to consider when discussing all of the things that we as media companies get wrong is that at least we get them wrong in a pretty visible way, which can be challenged. And I'm not excusing them, of course, but at least there's a regulation process, at least there's a complaints process. When you look further afield to the internet, where there is no accountability for saying things that aren't true. And one of the things that we tried to document in our 2022 documentary, Fire and Fury, was exactly that, looking at some of the main people who were driving that division and fraying our social cohesion. And they were targeting politicians and media and diverse communities. And you might recall from that time, there was a prominent law professor who was making the claim, for instance, that the Christchurch mosque shootings were an obvious red flag. False flag, rather, was her term. And that's just one example. So, I acknowledge that we don't always get it wrong, and it's not always a palpable thing that can be complained about, but at least there is a mechanism for holding us to account when we make mistakes. The thing that I'm worried about, at least, is worried about the issues that we face as media companies and working journalists, is the outrage entrepreneurs, as one of my friends calls them, out there whose living is derived from riling up audiences so that they heed them. And they're not subject to any regulation. They largely get away with saying whatever they want to say. I think at least as much harm is done by those kinds of organisations now towards diverse communities than is done by mainstream media companies. And I'm not saying that at all in any way to defend our failings, but I want us to be a little bit more alert, or alert as well to the much, much bigger picture that exists now. Kia ora koutou. I think that's all I have to say for now.
Yeah. Kia ora, Paula. Thank you so much for giving that wider context and what's happening behind the scenes that consumers or viewers may not see. So I appreciate that. I'll move on to our next panelist, the editor at the D-List, Olivia Shivas.
Kia ora, everyone. Ko Olivia Tukuingoa, calling from our office space in Tāhono Media in Kingsland. Thanks for having me. I thought I was going to share today a little bit about kind of a bit of my background, kind of moving between different types of media organizations, because I've covered kind of disability-focused media and also worked in mainstream media. And I think it's quite interesting seeing the shift in how we tell stories in those different spaces. So I have a background working in my first job out of uni was actually at Attitude TV, and so they made documentaries and programs about disabled people, mainly from broadcast on TV, but also moving into like online digital spaces as well. And so I think the big shift there in terms of how that industry changed, I could see back then, was how I was part of, I was a digital producer, producing as a way to move all the videos kind of like online. And they were wanting to build kind of like a hub of different videos about disabled people from kind of like TV platforms to online. And then from there, I worked at Stuff. So I was at Stuff for 5 years as a journalist working in quite a few different roles. Got to work with amazing Paula and Carmen as well, desk buddies. And so it was, really cool to shift through different roles there and seeing the different ways that news stories were told. And I was in quite a few different roles, from being a homepage editor, so working in a lot of breaking news situations, and then also working on the Potiaki team as a reporter. And in that space, I also mainly covered disability and social issues. And so, again, just seeing the different ways that kind of like Paula talked about in terms of time, and how that can be a real luxury as a journalist. When you're in a breaking news situation, you don't have the luxury of time. But often when you do have that time to build relationship with people and to tell their story more authentically, often the stories were also more powerful. And then also during my time there, I spent a lot of time covering the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care, so covering a lot of the disability hearings. And I think another thing that was interesting, I guess, regarding relationships was, because I had lived experience of having a disability as well, a lot of the people that I interviewed and reached out to also had disabilities. And so there was that kind of like shared understanding, which I would also call it a luxury, that people don't have the luxury of being able to connect with those communities that we're telling stories about. And now I work at the D-List. So as a bit of background, we're a hub for disability culture in Aotearoa. So we've been running for about 2.5 years now. So we have an online culture magazine that I'm the editor of, and we also do podcasts, videos, and social media storytelling as well. And then we have a physical space in Kingsland. We host events and gatherings, and that's a space for disabled people in the community to have their own space, and that's accessible for them as well. So I think it's been, just seeing just through the 10 years I've worked in the media, like seeing how different things have changed. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things. One is around disability storytelling and how, I guess, different representations of disabled people have shifted over time and what I've seen. So there's often a lot of negative stereotypes around disabled people, which can come down to seeing us as objects of pity, or a lot of the stories about us are around trauma. Or on the kind of other end of the scale is about inspiration. So seeing disabled people as kind of objects of inspiration for the narrative of a story. And so I guess that was one of the reasons why I wanted to work in the media, was because I couldn't relate to many of the stories about disabled people. And I do think that we have got better representation and things have changed in terms of there's more education, there's more awareness about disability communities. There's more journalists and more media makers with a disability, which I think helps. But there's still a long way to go in terms of we still see a lot of headlines pop up about disabled people, or using a wheelchair is a really terrible thing to happen to a person. But that's not the reality for many people in our communities. And so I guess, yeah, using those attention-grabbing headlines can be harmful on disability communities when you're constantly framed up as a negative because of a physical aspect you may have. And so I guess another thing that has changed is with regards to, things moving online. And I guess with the D-List, our first kind of product was an online magazine. We didn't have like a physical copy. I was thinking back to when I was studying journalism and I did an internship at what was Fairfax at the time, and I was writing at some community newspapers, so the Central Leader, Eastern Bay's Courier, and I remember we were like brought into a meeting and being told like, hey, all the articles we're writing now, they're all going to be moving onto stuff.co.nz, and we were all like, whoa, that's crazy. But now it's just a given that all the content and all the stories that we do will automatically go online now. And so I guess that shift online, which, is not a new thing, but I guess starting online is where we tell our stories at the D-List. There's definitely like benefits that we get to reach more people across the motu, but then also there can be like challenges that we face as well, and how even just online platforms itself are constantly changing. So some of the challenges that we kind of face in terms of adapting to this changing platform is in terms of like, we may do a podcast, for example, that's a 30-minute corridor between people sharing a story about being diagnosed with a disability, for example. And it's a really beautiful conversation within that 30 minutes. But we also want to be able to reach other audiences, say on TikTok or Instagram. And so how do we do it in a way that our videos are attention grabbing in those first few milliseconds, but without adding the full context of that corridor? Because often conversations around disability can be quite nuanced and layered and require more context, but it's really challenging to do in a way that's concise for audiences, which you need to grab their attention in, a few milliseconds. And then another challenge I guess we face in terms of what's changed and being able to produce our content online is, I guess, things like internet culture and rage. And like Paula said, there are people out there whose job it is to bring up rage, and how can we share stories about disability that don't feed, I guess, what you might call the rage machine, or stories about disability that must still kind of like reinforce harm. But how do we share stories about disability that are validating, but not create more rage and fear in terms of sharing our stories about and our experiences in a way that, without the full context that people often do need when they hear stories about disability. And then I think the last thing again, is about trust.
What's happened?
Oh, I think Olivia may be suffering a few tech problems there. Hopefully we can draw her back into the conversation, maybe at the back end during the Q&A session. But I do thank Olivia for her perspectives in the disability reporting space and the challenges that has historically, but also moving into new platforms and media. I guess it's time now to throw to the lovely Carmen Parahi to give her observations around the challenges of the media landscape.
Oh, okay. Kia ora. I think I disappeared and I came back. I was just wrapping up, but I think the last kind of point I was going to say was with regards to, wait, where were my notes? Hang on a minute. Yes, so building trust with our community, and yes, we're quite privileged, but we also build relationships because it's the right thing to do, and how, we want to take the time to get to know people, know their story, and the context to it. We're not kind of going in it to grab the headline. And so, yeah, I know later on we're going to be talking about solutions to some of the challenges that we're talking about, but could a media industry exists where we do have more time? Can we rebuild kind of the media model that gives us more time? I don't know, but that's, I guess, a question that hopefully between us we might be able to figure out. Yes, I think that was all I was going to share today, so thanks so much.
Awesome, Olivia, thank you. And we've talked about the challenges of the media, and here we've had displays already over the last half hour of tech problems and tech challenges, but we're all here and we all made it. I will throw it again, once again, to an old journalism school buddy. I won't say old, sorry, I just aged us both at the same time, but Carmen, your rako is yours.
Kia ora koutou, he tika koe, he old, ko ourau, me koe hoki. Tēnā koutou, he uri ahau o no kahungunu, no hine amaru no rongo whakata. E noho ana ki te mutu ara ko Waiheke. He mihi aroha ki a koe e Anjam, te kaiwhakahaere extraordinaire o Tāhono. He mihi aroha ki a koutou, ngā kairipuata o tēnei hui, ko koro rātou, ko Paula, ko Olivia, ko Moana. Actually, can I just say that these journalists here are actually pretty amazing. And I listened and enjoyed the kōrero from our first panel, and they are correct and right. We know these things about how the media operates and have done since the media first arrived on these shores last 2 centuries ago. And so we know these things, and we know that it can be improved. One of the things I wanted to talk to you today is the harm of the news media not existing. That is really important to me. And I wanted to explain that to you, take you through the challenges and solutions, some of the challenges and some of the solutions, because there are untold, and we could talk for days about all of the challenges newsrooms face. But the reasons why we need the news media is simple. We need regulated and self-regulated information with checks and balances, which Paula and Stacey talked about earlier, so it can be trusted, so that you know that the information you're getting is reliable, it's checked, and you can trust it. Truth needs a platform, it requires resourcing, and journalism connects us with information we didn't know we needed to know, or that we didn't need to know. So AI cannot walk into someone's house, have a cup of tea, and find out what's happening in the community. A journalist can, and they can tell us why that cup of tea matters to you and me. And I think the most important example that we've seen about why journalism matters is Gaza. And we have seen Gaza, what has happened to our journalists in Gaza, the storytelling that they have done with threat to life and limb is out the gate ridiculous. But that is the importance of journalism, and why, even though we talk about the harms of it, we also need to understand the harm of it not existing, and not existing with regulations and self-regulation. And so there are multiple challenges for the news media. One of them is definitions and types, because even today, here in the kōrero today, we move in and out of media, news, journalism rapidly, but actually we need to be very clear about the definitions. So when we're talking about media harm, we're talking about broadcasting harm, social media harm, journalism harm, newsrooms harm. We're talking about advertising harm, marketing harm, PR harm, movies. We're talking about all of these things. Not all of them are regulated or covered by the BSA or the Media Council. None of them are regulated by themselves either. And they all should be. And we all should be talking about all aspects of the media, not just the news media. The difference here is that the news media is regulated. They do self-regulate. That's a really important distinction. It also means that it can be trusted more than someone's opinion on social media. The other thing too is what we saw in Gaza is the powers and authority that tried to silence the voices through actually killing journalists and targeting them physically, as well as trying to undermine the value of that reporting that was coming out of Gaza. Those are the clear examples of why journalism should exist and why we need to support it more and why it needs to support itself more. So definitions, please, when you're talking about the media, be very clear about who you're talking about at the time. At the moment, we're talking about the news media, but we actually should be including here advertisers, PR companies, marketing, communications specialists, those that use communications to provide information, undermine information, use communications. Trust and news fatigue, I get concerned about this because we talk about trust in news and fatigue in news. And I get concerned because I worry about whether the public actually understands the distinction between news media, the distinction between social media, because frankly, there's way more harm on social media platforms and unregulated programs that look like news programs but won't call themselves news programs. And so that's what I'm talking about, distinctions and definitions. We need to be really clear about that. So revenue and funding, this is a major challenge. Today, as Moana hopefully will talk about, we will find out who is getting funded in the Māori media and who is not getting funded or who has lost some funding, which means that they can't give us as many Māori stories as we want to. So that in itself is a challenge. Who's resourcing which news outlets or media outlets, and how are they able to support our stories? And yes, Moana, it is today. Yes, today apparently, and so those things matter. That's a massive challenge. Revenue and funding. Everyone's like, oh, I don't want to talk about revenue and funding. Or you need to talk about it, and you need to understand that it's really important. I do not know why government doesn't do more to support more news organisations. And places like stuff in NZME, they have commercial models purposefully so they don't have to be dictated by bureaucracy that is involved with funding. And so all of these things create challenges about how they spend their money, where they spend the money, who they're going to pay to come into our newsrooms. The other thing is the other challenge is newsrooms. Like Paula said, man, they are getting smaller and smaller. And that's okay because, well, it's not okay because what we're bleeding out of those newsrooms is our senior, more experienced journalists. When we lose all that experience, what we're also losing is news history. So the people who can contextualize an issue right there and then, they're no longer in the newsrooms. So you have juniors and intermediate journalists who actually don't have a news history background, who don't have a news history. So can't just say, actually, this particular issue today is related to this. And that's why it matters. And so our newsrooms being decimated, that isn't an issue itself. However, I'll talk about possible solutions to that. And of course, representation. I always have the privilege, and I love it, being asked to speak to journalism students at different universities, which I really enjoy. And I love the enthusiasm that I hear, and they talk about what we love about journalism the most, which is holding power to account, unearthing new information that nobody knew about, but you definitely need to hear. And so, but when I look around in those newsrooms, and those journalist J schools, is the lack of diversity across where all our journalism students are coming from. And so it's in the responsibility to diversify our newsroom also comes from our J schools and being able to find all of our different speakers from different parts of our community, because man, Aotearoa New Zealand it's got so much colour, vibrancy. We've got umpteen languages, so many languages. So where is all that in our newsroom? So that representation absolutely needs to be there, but not just in our journalists, also in our editorials, in the editorial teams, management and ownership. So there are multiple challenges going on. A fiscal one is really the one that is draining out our newsrooms, and the fact the government won't actually two things: one, regulate the internet and regulate and actually seek money for the content that newsrooms and news organizations and media organizations have created for platforms. Facebook needs your content to exist. If we all decided not to put content on Facebook, it wouldn't exist. So they don't pay you for that content, and they definitely don't pay media companies for that content. So there are those sorts of challenges that exist that actually we really need to be cognitive of and understand. So there are solutions, and although newsrooms are getting smaller, there is diversity and strengthening happening. So one thing that I love about the future of news is the ecosystem that can exist for news. So it's programs like Moana's program, it's Olivia's D-List website, and community news happening all over the place. It's Māori language news, places like Ōkaha, so Māori language radio, Māori language television, all our different ethnic groups and their news. All of these things are creating an ecosystem for news, and that is what the future of news looks like. We can have our existing news organisations, they're called the legacy media, but that usually comes from the right by calling them the legacy media. But they are those ones that have existed for a long period of time, print newspapers that have gone digital, and the news websites, as well as news within communities, and not just geographical communities. I'm talking about cultural communities as well. We have the digital technology now to have that ecosystem of news. So for today, when we expect this funding for Māori news, there's funding for a Māori news platform, and that is where a organisation will actually bring in Māori news and then distribute it to people who want that Māori news. So I have no problem with that. Although I do think it may homogenise news, because I do want to see news with different perspectives from different companies. My other concern about it is that Māori news should be provided by all organisations anyway, news organisations, as a tiriti right, but also because frankly Māori news is just fascinating. And also, but smaller mobile newsrooms, right? So I really think that ecosystem can exist for example, Tāhono Media. Do your own news program, why not? There are multiple places to find funding, and that funding exists overseas as well as across the country as well. And so one of the other solutions I think that we need is the promotion of the news media. Frankly, the news media could do better in promoting itself and why journalism matters to all New Zealanders. And that way you can increase your audience and trust, and also bring in more revenue and more funding.
Awesome.
And so, the last thing I will say is there are ways to measure representation. We're in a digital age now. You can actually create tools that measures how many Māori stories you did today. So you published 20 news stories across your platforms, and only one of them was a Māori focused story, then obviously there's a disproportionate representation there. So there are definite ways that organisations can improve their representation by measuring it.
Kia ora. Thanks for that, Carmen. I appreciate it. Sorry, we know that Paula may have to go and deal to those 30 plus stories in a bit, and Moana also has some mahi to do, so I wanted to give a quick chance for Moana to have a kōrero before we maybe circle back around and finish off the session. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, mihi atu tēnei ki a koutou ngā kai kōrero, ngā kai whakahaere mo tēnei wānanga. Very honoured to be here today. Try not to get the imposter syndrome sitting next to you lot. Just to introduce myself, we're a very small team and it's getting smaller. Our current affairs show weekly, so the weekly deadline is challenging, as Paula and Carmen know. But our role, I feel like I'm totally, absolutely, passionately, obsessively driven to be in this space to try and help others connect the dots between some of the big issues of the day and the reality that others face. So we're not a newsroom. I would not be able to cope in a daily news thing. I'm finding this quite challenging. We're an independent company that has a warm and cosy, sometimes, relationship with Whakaata Māori, for which we're very grateful. Just talking about the challenges that me and my team face is similar to what Paula faces, is that there's so many issues. It's really difficult to know where to focus. They're just coming at us all the time. I saw a list of issues too, posted recently by the Toitū movement, and it was mind-boggling. The number of things that are impacting directly on Māori and Māori ability to address kind of systemic issues. So it's really challenging as a journalist and a small team, given the scarce resources, to make conscious decisions about what to focus on. Without being in reactionary mode all the time. A long form is really challenging because it obviously is such an important area. But also being conscious of not drowning people in constant negativity. So these are the things we kind of weigh up as we do our job. One of the things that's challenging in the Māori media sector is that, unlike commercial and state-owned media, Māori media funded through Te Māngai Pāho are primarily funded to save the language. And that puts added pressure on a small workforce. And this last funding round was extremely competitive and very distressing, because each show, or, Te Karere, the Hui, the handful of us in this area, we are very collaborative and collegial. We have different styles. We're forced to compete for very limited funding, and the criteria to be able to get that funding has really amped up. So primary platforms need to invest as well to match that public funding from TMP. And that has happened with some and probably not with the other. But it's really, really important that all New Zealanders hear and see news and current affairs through a Māori lens, in English too. The other thing that people have talked about is trust, the demonising of journalism. It's undermining trust. Simply asking questions of political leaders attracts a lot of heat, and legitimate questions are mischaracterised as racist, aggressive, nagging, emotional, overreaction. So that's a challenging space to be in. The rise of, it has been mentioned, the rise of unregulated, I don't know if you call them counter-journalists, I don't know what you call them. Paula had a name, but spreading misinformation means that Māori media has to make decisions about whether to, I guess all media, about whether to ignore or address such misinformation. There's always been misinformation, dodgy characters who shouldn't have got airtime back in the day because they're unwell or unhinged. There's even more now of people online claiming to be, as one of my mates said, a messiah or a māngai. So these are the real challenges that we're facing in competition with our own responsibilities to be fair, balanced and accurate. The racism that is framing Māori media as subversive, threatening, biased, when we present an issue or a story through a Māori lens that has been historically missing, that's very challenging. And Māori journos get slammed as arrogant, racist and radical by those who don't really want Māori media to exist at all. Or if Māori challenge Māori leaders, we get called politically biased, colonised sellouts. So it's a fun fest. For women, of course, it's far worse. Attacks around identity and cultural authenticity that we worry will translate into physical threats. I've had that experience myself. The facts, Jesus. That's very difficult, that evidence-based journalism doesn't seem to cut it anymore. And Paula and her teams have done lots of work in that area. The way that political figures dismiss facts and data as wokeism means that our role as journalism is quite challenging. Seeing the misappropriation of phrases and stuff from the social justice and civil rights movements to challenge Māori, Muslim, tangata tiriti, rainbow voices presents a number of challenges. As Paula says, the no rules thing, we all understand that, I came into this role as a documentary maker and as a musician, trying to figure out how this whole journalism thing works, and lucky enough to be mentored by a couple of goats like Colin McRae and Cameron Bennett, who said fair, balanced and accurate. We understand our need to align with the standards, and we use lawyers. They cost an arm and a leg. We use them before we take something to air that might be contentious, or after, if something flares up we didn't expect. And yet we're having to compete with something that really gets on my nerves, and I don't know how it works in this journalism space, is that journalists, for example, in a well-known media platform have to be fair, balanced and accurate, but advertisers in that same platform, using that same platform, can take out a full-page advertisement that catastrophizes something Māori, and there's no compulsion for counter-editorial from that particular media platform. We are left, the rest of us are left kind of like contain that or try and rebut the stuff that's going out there. And the use of both-sidism is more and more difficult and hurtful distraction, as Mohan referred to with regard to the Israel and Gaza situation. Funding is really difficult. Te Māngai Paho is a key funder for a show like ours, along with Whakaata Māori. The baseline funding hasn't kept up for TMP and Whakaata Māori, so we can't actually plan ahead. We're yearly. That's it. Every year it's a run for the board, and quite stressful. No ability to kind of attract, train, and retain newbies who might have great deal but no journalism skills. And as Carmen has said, with newsrooms being gutted, the first to go are the most mature and experienced journalists, and that has an impact. The digital era has its pros and cons. It's it's quite torturous. It's a time-consuming and specialist skill that a lot of us don't have that ability to kind of grow. The curation, you have to be really careful about that. E-tangata, which I'm a trustee of, has just had to turn off comments on Facebook because of just abject racism. Advocacy journalism, people say, you know, we're not being objective. I would call it insightful. I still don't understand the nuances around being fair, balanced, and inaccurate in a way when the world is not fair or balanced. But if we look at the standards that we use to measure our stories and what we do, at least it gives us some kinds of principles and values to weigh up and guide our work. There's, I guess, just in finishing, one of the things I'm worried about, and I was exposed to when I went to a global investigative journalism conference in Sweden recently, and heard Carol Codwalder, who exposed the Cambridge Analytica scandal, speak. She warned us of elections being a singular event, that they're a zero-sum game that attracts motivated actors and a lot of money. So I'm keeping that in mind as we head into next year, that some of the advice and solutions that were proffered at that particular conference were to develop and continue links with international journals, because particularly around investigating elections, because the same tactics and manipulations are at play in several countries. I guess keeping standards up ourselves as journalists, collaborating. I see that in the Māori media space with things like the Kingitanga, Tangihana, Matatini, and it's really awesome. It really is awesome just to see everyone come together, and to keep up the collaborations and cooperations with other journalists, but also with academics and data specialists. Those people carry such a great weight of knowledge that we can use for the betterment of journalism. So
Awesome.
I'm not sure how helpful that was. Sorry, it was a bit of an unload.
No, it was awesome, and it's so great to hear from all of you and your vast experience and expertise. I just wanted to give a chance to Paula, because I know you have to probably leave quite soon. If there's anything you wanted to add, I know you answered a question around your story selection with the load that you have and the lack of resources, or anything else you'd like to add before you need to part?
Nothing specific, just tautoko what all the other panelists have said. It's a very realistic portrayal of the challenges that are facing the industry. The question that somebody had specifically asked was on that list of 30 stories, what considerations I put into which ones to choose. And sometimes you don't even kind of get the opportunity to consider it because it's news, right? The news happens and you have to do the news. But my answer was that that's the kinds of stories that I put on my own list are the ones that I have sort of tended for whatever reason to gravitate towards throughout my journalism career, which have been involving an injustice of one form or another, where there seems to be an imbalance of power. But what I explained to this questioner concerns me about that is that, as I alluded to before, is that I won't get to all of them, and that's the thing that fundamentally concerns me, which Carmen has talked about. Do we want to sometimes quite deeply flawed media, or do we want no media? Because the consequences of some of those stories that I can't tell, not being told, I think really is at the core of what I'm worried about, which is our democratic role in a society and the pressures that are placed on us at the moment is the point I would like to leave you with.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Ngā mihi nui kia koe, not just for today, but for your ongoing work, and particularly, as you say, in that social justice area that you you focus on a lot. So
Yeah.
I appreciate your time. There are a few other questions in the Q&A, the partai box, if you like, that I'll throw to the rest of the panelists as before we finish this session. Are there any ways the public can support newsrooms doing good work to push back that anti-media sentiment that seems to be shared by governments across the world, to be honest, aside from paying for news through paywalls, which might be a thing? Oh, everyone's shy now. Any suggestions on how the public can push back on anti-media sentiment?
So they can share stories as well. Share story like on social media, share stories across social media, or respond in one thing that I do get hoha with and have mentioned it in their social medias at time is media, news, so using my definition properly, news media organisations that actually post stories in Facebook, for example, and then don't moderate enough. And then you get all this hate piling in straight away. And so the public could actually help with that response as well by responding back and saying, that is not what's going on here. You are causing harm to the journalist or whoever's in the story. The other one is, actually, you did mention it, is actually pay for it. Pay for, I think they're like this places like the New York Times, it's like $1, or actually the Post and that, it's like $1.99 a week. And so there's places where you can support by paying, but also supporting journalists when you see journalists online or on that way, but also holding journalism to account, and which often happens on social media as well.
Yeah, it's great that concept of community moderation. I've seen often, as you point out, the community itself correcting those loud, squeaky minorities sometimes. Here's a question specifically for Olivia. In the UK and maybe other countries as well, this week is Invisible Disabilities Week, and apparently 80% of disabilities are invisible. Do you know if we have a similar situation in New Zealand, and what part does the media have in either promoting or informing or educating in that space?
I don't know the exact numbers in terms of what percentage of people are diagnosed with invisible disabilities. And I think there's an interesting shift in terms of also like the work we do at the D-List is when people approach us, we don't actually ask them for their diagnosis, and there's kind of a shift in the way of how we label and identify as disabled. And so I don't know those exact numbers, but I would say that, yeah, there is a large portion of people who have invisible disabilities that we may not know that are obvious. In terms of, I guess, stories, I think that's another thing is like, we don't ask people to like show their mobility permit when they show up at our door or on our inbox when they want to engage with the D-List. And so I guess we put a lot of time into, again, it's about building those relationships and what part of yourself people want to share in terms of sharing their journey with their disability. And I think in terms of how we frame up, invisible disabilities in our storytelling is we're big fans of the social model of disability. So it's not to do with a person's physical impairment that disables them in the community, but it's the external barriers. So I use a wheelchair. So as example is having stairs to enter a building is a physical barrier for me. But for someone else, say with an invisible disability, that barrier might be a long wait list to healthcare in our healthcare system, for example. So there are different models of how we frame up disabilities, of not putting it on the person, but in terms of the systems, infrastructure that are barriers to us having a full life.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Olivia. And I'm aware of the time, so there are a couple of other questions which are kind of more generic, which we can get to in the third session, but I just wanted to thank all our panelists for sharing their insights around the need to build trust and relationship, the democratic function of journalism, the need to also be definite and certain about what media you're talking about, news media, mass media, what it might be, the challenge of resourcing, not just how much resourcing, just who's making the resourcing decisions and what it impacts. And also, I loved that the point to the elections and how that's a zero-sum game, and one solution to that could be building international connections within the media and communities, because this is a global phenomenon that's happening across the world. So I want to thank you all. E ngā mare kura, ngā mihi maioha kia koutou, mō tō koutou mohiatanga me aroha. Thank you so much for everything you've provided. I just wanted to I just underline how important your roles are, and everyone that we've heard from so far, just by probably stealing something that I heard from Te Wehi Wright, who talked about the importance of storytellers and how storytellers are the hope for Aotearoa. And he talked about storytellers influence the narrative, narrative creates the value, value drives the behavior, which is the hope for our for positive change in Aotearoa. So thank you again, and thank you everyone else for listening. I'll throw to Anjum now.
Kia ora koutou, welcome back for our third and final session for our symposium today. We're now focusing on a session that looks at solutions to some of the problems that have been discussed. And I'd like to pass over to our moderator, Juliana.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Juliana tupoekoa. So welcome to the third and final panel of our webinar today, and what we can do to build stronger, more inclusive media ecosystems in Aotearoa. So this session will be a little bit different. We are keeping it free flow, conversational. So think it is a collective korero rather than a formal panel. Our speakers will share solution-focused ideas, and we want to hear from you, your questions, reflections, provocations. Put them in the Q&A as we welcome you to explore how to make our media spaces fairer, more representative and inclusive. We also will have Ridish Parekh joining us as a panelist for this third session. He has been a part of the Tāhono Media since the beginning and is the spokesperson for the group. And we will be answering questions. He will be answering questions from Tāhono Media's perspective, contributing to the korero in finding solutions. But we're now going to hear again from Professor Mohan Dutta, another recorded video. So if we can play the video, that would be great.
Kia ora koutou. In this part of the talk, I will talk about what we can do in terms of building just media. My focus here is on building media infrastructures that foreground the voices of communities that have historically been marginalized, but also grapple with questions around media ownership. What, for instance, does it mean for communities, and particularly communities at the margins, to own media infrastructures? So let's turn to the concept of voice infrastructures. That is a key element in my work. And voice infrastructures can be defined as systems, platforms, norms, and processes through which communities can express their voices, share their stories, and most importantly, participate in decision-making. If we look at theories such as agenda setting theory and framing theory, they point to the organizing role of media in constituting political and economic structures. And in that sense, building alternative voice infrastructures is really critical to transforming the colonial, racial, capitalist, imperial structures. So the culture-centered approach, the framework that I work with in theorizing voice infrastructures, talks about two critical elements in this transformative process. First and foremost, it talks about ways in which we can change the hegemonic structures of organizing media by dismantling these structures, co-creating with communities alternative structures such as community ownership of storytelling resources. This can take the form of community radio, or it can take the form of People's Media Archive. It can take the form of radical independent media where the media waves are owned and controlled by communities. So in terms of the project of decolonizing media infrastructures, then it's important to think about these questions of ownership in relationship to communities as spaces of struggles within social movements, where movements can narrate their own stories rather than or challenging the stories that are framed through the media. How do we place media within activist interventions and within everyday performative life of communities? So this process of transformation then talks about transforming both ownership of media as well as systems of accountability. So we can think of building resources such that communities at the margins can own the media, particularly those at the intersectional margins of communities who have historically been disenfranchised. How do we center community expectations as parameters for determining the accountability of media, as well as for shaping media pedagogies and pedagogies of storytelling? How do we create registers of accountability within communities such that communities can mobilize to both create policy infrastructures and then hold media accountable to these policy infrastructures? So when moving from ownership to questions of policy, we can think broadly of community participation in shaping governance systems and regulatory mechanisms, anchoring these mechanisms in the voices of communities at the margins. This also calls for building tools of media literacy, particularly literacy around media processes and media policies, working with communities to create registers for these literacies so that communities can participate in those decision-making processes. It's important in this process to talk about collectivization, to talk about ways in which we can challenge the individualizing work of whiteness and create registers that bring communities together. In Aotearoa, how can we anchor these conversations in Tinuranga Tiratanga, in notions of sovereignty, particularly attending to the participation of communities who have historically been disenfranchised, being able to articulate collective rights, being able to narrate collective stories, developing collectively the kinds of narratives that are meaningful to community life. And these narratives then become the basis for witnessing the colonial, racial, capitalist, and imperial violence, but also as a basis for then imagining other transformative possibilities. These systems of ownership anchored in collectivization decenter the architectures of surveillance and authoritarian erasure that are built into hegemonic media systems. Anchoring these processes in sovereignty at care, for instance, we have been working with placing media infrastructures as voice within land occupations or within community movements for growing kai, within community gardens. And we have done this work, for over 3 decades in various contexts. And one of the most powerful things to note here is the transformative power of land and connection with land, relationship with communities articulated through land as a basis for transforming the media ecosystems and media architectures, including the rules of media participation. So these transformations in media ownership can become the basis for reimagining our democracies and organizing democracies in radically transformative ways, such that if we consider the question of Tethriti and constitutional transformation, it gives one way of thinking through how we can reimagine media ownership and its relationship to Tinaranga Tiratanga. How can we anchor media in Indigenous and Global South knowledge systems and in the logics and imaginaries that emerge from these knowledge systems? And how do we build community and public pedagogies such that publics, and particularly those at the margins of communities, feel empowered to participate in decision-making processes around media policy, regulatory standards, and media governance? So to wrap up, I see hope in our ability to collectively weave our futures by building transformative spaces where communities can own media architectures, media infrastructures, but also pedagogies around media. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so do you want to have Stacey? I think if you have the magic wand and could, design a new broadcasting legislation, what will be the key elements that you would like to see? Because I think that's what we're talking here is a systems change, and legislation will be a key part of that.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of thought has gone into this. There's different ways to do it. Different countries around the world have taken different approaches, all coming from the problem of having outdated models that you then have to try and rebuild. Whereas, in an ideal world, you would be starting from scratch, but it's difficult to do that. So, I think principles are, the current proposal that the government has out for a modern, effective regulator has some really sensible fundamental principles. It talks about being system level and platform neutral. So, regulating the types of content and media that you want to regulate rather than the specific individual types of, is it in written form? Is it a video? Is it on the internet? Is it on whatever? And I would like to see more of a move to a regulator-led model rather than a complainant-led model for the reasons that I spoke about earlier. So that the regulator if it's us, we've got 36 years of experience. It's potentially a better management of a system to have the regulator decide what needs to be investigated rather than being led by every complaint that comes into the inbox. But the details, the devil's always in the details. I think you've got to decide what is it that you're wanting to regulate, what is the harm that you're trying to prevent, and how do you do that while upholding freedom of expression, which everyone agrees is a good thing.
And how do you adjust for the reality that we have now? The media, as we were talking, and having those definitions, it changed so much, and the pace.
It changed so fast, and you have to think, what is it going to look like in another 35 years? What can we not comprehend now that we might need to regulate in the future?
Yeah, I would say the next 5 years, the way things are moving so fast. Yeah, but I would love to hear other panelists as well, if you have any thoughts around those challenges around the structure and regulatory challenges. If you have any ideas of solution-focused ideas on how we could improve things. The broadcasting legislation is a piece of the puzzle to improve the changes that we need to see in the media landscape. If you have any thoughts around that.
Stacey, if I could, I think my question is, it's also the narrative around what the BSA does, of course.
Consequences of having smaller newsrooms and how that affects our communities is that the smaller newsrooms that we have, the smaller number of voices and perspectives that are then also reflected outside of the newsroom. So you've got the same group of people who are contacting the same people for their stories. And and you don't have the time and resource to go beyond the most click-worthy headline story. And yeah, I think that, like you said, Carmen, that like critical thinking into what goes into unpacking a story beyond the headline is also a risk. So, we'll keep resorting to, like I referred to earlier, those negative stereotypes about disability. Those stories will just keep being reproduced and retold. We'll have, the same stories about mobility parking for another 20 years unless we have a bit more critical thinking about why it's an issue and why it's still affecting so many disabled people, for example. So I think that there are real life impacts on our communities because how minority groups, disabled people, Māori, Rainbow Pacifica people, how we see ourselves in the media is also harmful on ourselves as well. So I think those are some kind of actual risks.
Right. Yeah, no, that's so true. And I think the critical thinking it's fundamental. And for me, I'm a disabled person as well. One of the things that concerns me a lot with the shrinking of the newsrooms is that historically our voices have not been very present. Usually we even engaging with us to get our perspective in a variety of subjects because disabled people exist in all those places, in all those other minorities. If you think there are disabled people in the rainbow, there are disabled people as seniors, there are disabled people as children and Maori and Pacifica. But I remember, and I will not name the media outlet. I was assisting with telling a story of a deaf person connecting with the journalist, and I didn't have a budget for an interpreter. So, like if the media doesn't have the resources to do the basics, imagine to actually include the voices when you need some reasonable accommodations to actually engage with, the subject of the story. Yeah. So another challenge that came up was around the digital platforms. And Olivia, you mentioned the tension between authentic storytelling and short form content for platforms like TikTok and Instagram. How do you preserve depth and nuance in that environment? And I would like to hear from others as well, because the way that we live today, information is consumed it's 30 seconds. And it's just so much, and people just keep scrolling. So how do you get across and cut the noise and all the TikTok videos of cats, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is really challenging, and we have a lot of discussions about it within the team in terms of if we share this 30 seconds of someone saying this thing, how will it land? Is it safe for that person? Is it safe for the person who's watching it? Is it safe for other people in that intersection of the community? So we're constantly reflecting and thinking, okay, how will this land? And picture this person in our head. How will it land for that kind of person? Say, someone who's newly diagnosed, someone who's had a spinal cord injury. How will it land for different communities? And so that's really important to us because we have, made decisions not to publish particular things because it doesn't keep the person safe with, out of context of a wider conversation. So I guess when it comes to selecting what short clips we will share online, it's to ensure that, the independent clip as a standalone piece makes sense and people can still enjoy it and still get 1 point perhaps of 30 points, in a 1 hour conversation. And again, we prioritize relationships and time with people. So, we have extra processes to check with people that they feel comfortable what we share before we post it, and ensuring that, we have time built in, buffered into the, timeline that we can have those discussions and think about it without having to rush to meet a deadline or rush to beat another news outlet.
If I could jump in, and building on from what Olivia said, let's take that example and say there's two ways to look at it, right? Two sets of capacity building. One is how do we ensure that these communities know how to reach the media in pitching stories and having their voice? How will the media ensure who to go to and not just knock on one door and think that one disabled person can somehow represent every other and every other form of disability? And the second leg is how do we do capacity building so that we have more Olivias telling their stories and sharing content? And what kind of support can they look at? And what kind of systems can we have in place to build ecosystems of that sort? And another one, Carmen, that I had was, I think you said stuff has now gotten off Facebook, right? I think my question is that if one news platform goes off a behemoth like Facebook, do you not think it creates a vacuum which now then will be filled by counter voices? So just wanted to understand the logic and how do we then ensure that that vacuum's not filled by with misinformation.
So stuff, well, they may have changed the policy since I left, but they will use Facebook and Instagram if there's a mass breaking news story and there's a public event happening that actually they need to help inform the public. But for two reasons. One, because Facebook refused to pay news organizations for all the content. And two, it was increasingly difficult to moderate, as Olivia would know, because Olivia would have to do this in her digital role, used to have to moderate those social media accounts, and they were very challenging. It took a lot of resource to moderate because Facebook does not. Doesn't enough, moderate. And so I would love to see all news organizations actually leave all of those social media platforms because they are unregulated. They do not regulate themselves. They are very, very harmful. And unfortunately, human nature being what it is, we love it and we will go there and do things that we wouldn't do in person. And so I don't really care about the vacuum because you can find TVNZ stories on their own websites. And you can go to Stuff. They have a beautiful website, actually, that keeps changing and transforming bit by bit. So you can go to those digital sites to get your news and subscribe to the Post or subscribe to the Herald or subscriptions is a really good form of ensuring that you get quality information that has been checked, that has been taken through a rigorous accounting. As Moana said, they even go to the lawyers. Like, people don't realize how much money is spent by newsrooms on lawyers to check something. The great chilling effect that is happening now is, and even for the BSA, even for Stacey, the chilling effect is the right consistently threatening with their millions and millions of dollars to shut down journalists, to shut down people like the BSA from actually regulating those social media platforms. Social media platforms bring in a lot of money for a small group of people. They are doing everything they can to protect that money. And because of that, they have people who they sponsor to then help spread misinformation in these unregulated, that look like newsrooms. So there's a lot of complicated and complex stuff going on, but as critical thinkers, we must always see straight through the bullshit. So I don't care if news organizations come off social media. They go there for the audience. That's it. And Stacey, good job. Get in there, girl. I'm like absolutely support the work of the BSA or the Media Council to actually start to push the government, any government, to regulate.
Yeah, I can totally agree and talk to that Stacey, like huge respect for the mahi that you're doing. And I think that it will happen something that's similar what happened with Twitter, now X. You know, it was a source of information, and now you see a lot of people leaving the platform. So the problem is misinformation is here. And I think that Stacey, one of the things that what can be done to make complaint systems more accessible, specifically for communities that feel unsafe, challenging the misinformation or the media institutions?
I think, as I sort of talked about a little bit before, I think making a complaint system more accessible means not making it the responsibility of the complainant to identify and set out and sort of lead the complaint. Because that's quite an imbalance, isn't it? And a member of the public versus a media organisation. Some media organisations are very small, but others are very large. And, why is it on a member of the public to understand the nuances of the regulatory system and to put themselves out there against the media and lead that process? If there's going to be a regulator appointed, you're saying that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. The regulator do it, and it's a different thing. But the way the Commerce Commission, for example, assigns their resources is they'll take complaints, sure, but they're not going to respond to or address every complaint. But if, for example, they suddenly start getting hundreds of complaints over here in this space where there's not been complaints before, they might go, that's something we need to look into. So I think that's how we make it more accessible, is by not putting so much responsibility on the public when it actually should be a regulator's job.
Thank you. And one question for across the panel before we try to play the video that we couldn't play at the beginning. How do you think we can rebuild public's understanding of what verified evidence-based journalism looks like? So we can stop having your uncle or auntie saying, "Oh, this isn't happening. Oh, where did you get this news from? Oh, it was in my Facebook group, or well, it was in my WhatsApp." So how can we make people understand what evidence-based journalism looks like? Who wants to jump in that question?
Sorry, for me, I think it's having the silver fern mark, like the silver fern mark of the institutions like the BSA, that if something's regulated, then one needs to trust, and the institution needs to have teeth then, that if it's not accurate, you can take action. And I think that's where I probably agree with you, Stacey, that you cannot just rely on the public having to knock on your door, but rather more proactive, that if something's regulated by you, the public can trust that the fact that they're regulated by you means something.
Newsrooms could also do a better job of letting the public know that they self-regulate as well. So all of them do, and they have their own standards, newsroom standards as well. But it's hard to find it sometimes, so you've got to scroll for multiple places to find it. So that could be more prominent on a website as well, so that the public can always see, oh, actually, these people are guided by these principles here, which I really like. One thing I will say about what Olivia said earlier about how their team thinks about the 30-second clip is that actually not all newsrooms think that way at all. And that's that independent of thought and voice, so that they will They will consider it to a certain extent, but not as far as a place like D-List will consider it. And so, and this is this independence of voice, being independent, freedom of speech, free speech, which is somebody put out, freedom of speech versus free speech, two different things, and are highly weaponized. And so we should understand the reality of news organizations, that actually different organizations have different values and principles. But I think perhaps it could be regulated, that it's stated constantly for the public to see all the time. Of course, all news media would absolutely hate that suggestion I just made, but that could be a way of doing it as well, is that you just have to state what your values and principles are and what your complaints processes is, rather than having to go and search for it.
Thank you. There's a new question that came from the audience. How do we ensure that the regulators are not perpetuating the dominant colonial biases? I think we need to occupy spaces, it's about having diverse voices, but I will let the panelists to contribute to addressing this question from the audience.
I think this was a question, Stacey, that how do you ensure that regulators don't perpetuate biases?
Great question. And, here or there, whether I'm the best person to answer it. But one way that we try to ensure we don't have blind spots is with our regular surveys, research, external review, litmus testing, to check that the public generally agree with how decisions are being made. Because we can't, although there is an appeal process for decisions, we can't rely on people, going to the trouble and the cost of taking us to the High Court to know if our decisions are right or wrong. We want to be sure that they're right across the board. So that's what we do every year. We report on those results in our annual reports and publish them generally as well. They're all on our website, so you can see and we choose different standards and focus areas each year depending on what topical issues are. So we're not just sort of scattergun approach to going, okay, this has been a hot button issue this year, let's check that we've been applying our standards consistently. So we do what we can, because we recognise that at its core, the authority's role is not to decide what the standards are. The authority's job within the limits of the Act, because the Act does say some of the kinds of standards we have to have, but the authority's job is to find out what those standards mean to the public and apply those. That'd be my response.
So I think that's one final question that I would like to pose to you all as we wrap up this panel, and that is, what collective actions could strengthen collaborations among, between independent, community, and mainstream journalists in Aotearoa?
Tāhono Media. I think that's what I see our role as, which is having more of these conversations and thinking of ways of bridging that gap, because what an incredible panel we've had today, where we've had regulators, media, community. So I think more of this regularly and working towards a national strategy. I think one of the things, Carmen, I think there was a question that the things that you learn from Pautiaki, is there like a national blueprint that could be utilized and that we can learn from and see if there are lessons to be learned from that strategy?
Oh, yeah. I did respond to that in the Q&A as well. So two things. One, equity has become a really dirty word at the moment. And so, as Belinda talked about earlier, all the funding for equity and improving representation and voice, stories, research, personnel, across all systems of information has been diminished, undermined. There's a major push by those in power, economically as well as in government and in all places of authority, even those who own media companies or are trying to own media companies. There is a push against equity and improving representation. Why is that? Because people want to protect power and people want to continue the status quo of yesteryear. And so that is what everyone is up against at the minute. And so because of that, it is now a little bit more difficult and challenging, as you know, because DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been cut. Literally, it's become illegal in America. What is that? So that sort of push against improving representation, what Pōtiaki was about, that support for that no longer exists where power exists. But there are still enough people trying to do good, and there are still enough people that support, for example, treaty rights, Te Tiriti o Waitangi rights, but also we have come a long way in the last few decades to stop us from going backwards, right? There's still enough good people in places to push back against power and the status quo. So that's issue one. Two, Pōtiaki belongs to stuff. It's their kaupapa. They did a lot of actions in it. Both Olivia and I were a part of that. I loved it, but I wasn't there long enough to totally embed it into the system and so that it continues today. But it is still there in some form. It's still kicking along. So mana taurite, which is equity, that exists, and that is a template that can be used for all other institutions that are part of the communications and media systems, right? So when we were doing our Pōtiaki work, we worked with advertisers, media agencies, all the different broadcasters, print, across the whole mediascape, rather than just news media. So yes, absolutely, improve representation and equity in all parts of society, and it can be templated indeed for news media organisations. A lot of doing it though. Spin-off, RNZ, they are doing it, and TVNZ to some degree, right? So they are doing it. It's just there is a demand from people who will come and watch, who will come here today for more and better. And what I've learned from my tipuna, and it was a hard lesson for me to learn while I was at stuff, was it's going to take time for change. We are currently up against the status quo, and we are fighting against that at the moment. But it is going to take time, and it's going to take generations. My tipuna worked over generations to create change for Māori, and unfortunately, it's going to take generations for us to shift to a place of fairness and equity.
Absolutely. And I think we need to occupy spaces. And I just want to make a comment that around language. Someone uses the term blind spot. And I just want to flag that's ableist language that is just so ingrained in the way that we talk and think about. So I just cannot let that pass. You can use something else, yeah. But our time is up. It was so great to have you all here, giving your time and expertise and contributing to this korero. And I agree with British. We need to continue doing initiatives like that when we bring people together to discuss those really crucial issues. The harm of not having journalism is hard to put into words. I will now pass to Anjun to close us off. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. So let me first of all thank all of our wonderful panelists, both community, academic and media. we know it's not easy to have these conversations, and we know that when you put yourself in the spotlight and speak up, particularly around these kinds of issues, it can be quite unsafe. So we really appreciate that you've been willing to come here and share. You know, I really want to shout out to you, Stacey, in terms of what must be a bit of a difficult period for BSA right now. And, you know, thanking all of you for the work that you do. And I think also, you know, we see that it's a very complex and difficult problem, multifaceted, but we are, you know, and Tāhono Media is keen to keep working in this area to make the changes that we can make, to bring communities along into the conversation. So please feel free to get in touch with us. You can do that via the website. In terms of Tāhono Trust, we've got a couple of webinars coming up in a different space, one tomorrow around online harm and one next week, which is getting some international speakers to talk about their experiences of legislation in the internet space. So you'll find details of those all on our social media. We will check in with Mohan to see if he's good with us sharing that video with you, because we do feel he went to the trouble of recording his thoughts and we would like to share that, but we will do that with consent. Okay, so I am just going to share my screen so that I can do the closing karakia, and you can, for those of you who can see it, hopefully. Right. Pahiki te tapu, kia watia ai te ara, kia turiki ai te ao marama, hui e, taiki e. The translation there, restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and unified. That's us for today. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to those of you who've lasted the whole time. I know it has been a huge time commitment, but I hope that you felt it's been a valuable one. Kia ora.